Every great boom swears it has found a new law of finance. In 1873, the conviction was that railroads could outrun risk, that credit could stretch to the horizon, that gold and silver together would always keep the system balanced. Then, almost overnight, the music stopped. Banks slammed their doors. Stock exchanges went silent. Trains still moved, coal still burned, factories still hummed, but money, the permission that made everything function, froze in place. Here's the riddle that confounded a confident age. When the rails were laid, the furnaces lit, and the granaries full, why did everything seize as if a winter had fallen on the world's balance sheets? The answer begins in the glow before the break. The Franco-Prussian War had ended with parades and indemnities. A newly forged German empire stood triumphant, and billions in French gold flowed toward Berlin and the great banking houses of Central Europe. In America, the continent was being stitched together in iron. Railroads were not merely companies. They were national destiny made of metal and motion. Towns bribed them for a stop. Legislatures showered them with land. Newspapers cheered every ceremonial spike pounded into ties. The public bought shares and bonds the way a proud family buys a portrait, something that proves a place in the future. Underwriters multiplied securities to meet the hunger. First mortgage bonds, income bonds, preferred shares, common shares, debentures layered on debentures. The machine converting optimism into obligations ran at a heroic clip. But the machine had a hidden flaw. The projects were long, the funding was short. Track, engines, bridges, and tunnels demanded capital for years. The credit supporting them needed to be rolled over in months. As long as new money arrived to replace old, as long as primary markets were open and eager, the mismatch was an invisible miracle. The moment the pipeline thinned, the miracle revealed itself as arithmetic. Interest costs did not rest. Coupons arrived whether passengers did or not. Lines through empty countries looked like wealth on a balance sheet and looked like a leak in a treasury. The first real tremor came not from the American prairie, but from the salons of Vienna. On May 9, 1873, the Austrian market cracked. Speculation in grand construction schemes and urban mortgages had floated for years on easy credit and rising prices. When prices finally sagged and buyers stepped away, the exchange buckled. That break was not provincial. The capital is a flock animal. Doubt in one square provokes flight in many. Telegrams carried unease as efficiently as they carried orders. If the Viennese paper could lie, the Berlin paper might lie. If Berlin trembled, London had better tighten its own belt. The great houses that straddled countries and industries discovered that reputation travels farther than collateral. A prudent portfolio suddenly looked like a single trade. Sell what can be sold, hoard what cannot be printed. Across the Atlantic, America held the tinder pile. The most luminous name in the country's finance, J. Cook, had minted patriotic credibility selling Union war bonds. His firm turned that reputation toward a new miracle, a transcontinental line to the Northwest, the Northern Pacific. Optimism was converted into certificates. Certificates were converted into cash. Cash was converted into track. Each new issue of bonds kept yesterday's promises alive, and tonight's construction crew paid. But optimism is not oxygen. When European money cooled after Vienna, the river of foreign capital feeding American projects became a trickle. A trickle cannot float a railroad. In September 1873, arithmetic ended the debate. J. Cook and Company suspended. In that era, the fall of a great house was like a major artery being clamped shut. Correspondent banks called in balances. Depositors formed lines as long as their fear. Brokers scrambled to find bids that had evaporated between one telegram and the next. The New York Stock Exchange chose the lesser terror and closed for days as if ignorance were a valid price. A freeze does not announce itself with a single sound. It is an orchestra of silences. The promissory notes that are not renewed, the trade credit that is not extended, the polite letter that says, regretfully cannot oblige. While speculators chased rails and builders chased monuments, another story moved beneath their feet. The money itself was changing. For centuries, a messy but functional compromise had prevailed, bimetallism. Gold and silver both served as money, with mint ratios and market ratios tugging and bumping but keeping the system elastic. If gold supply tightened, silver could bear more of the load. In the early 1870s, that elastic began to shrink. Germany, flush with French gold, abandoned silver coinage and committed to the gold standard. The Latin Monetary Union was fraying, struggling to reconcile coinage across borders. In the United States, the Coinage Act of 1873 quietly ended the production of the standard silver dollar. A later generation would scream crime of 73, but at the time it read like housekeeping in a rulebook. The effect was not housekeeping. It was a subtle tightening of the hinge upon which credit swings. Base money is the oxygen of credit, not merely the quantity of coins in vaults, but the expected path of what money will be available and acceptable tomorrow. Shrink that expected path, and a system accustomed to expansion begins to plan for contraction. Prices grow sticky, debts do not. A merchant who borrowed last spring for inventory expects to pay in dollars earned this autumn. If autumn prices fall and the dollars are harder to find, last spring's plan becomes a trap. It is not necessary to assign sinister motives to policymakers to see the outcome. A world converging on a tighter monetary standard created competition for gold, and competition for gold rewards hoarding. In practical terms, a panic is a failure of rollovers. Old debts expect new buyers. New buyers expect lower prices to compensate for risk and scarcity. The lower price offered in a panic is the bid that assumes even lower prices tomorrow. Sellers look over a cliff and step back. Buyers look up at that same cliff and calculate falling rocks. Collateral shrinks because it was all the same kind of collateral. Railway bonds whose value depended on traffic, that depended on growth, that depended on credit. Everything is correlated at the bottom of the cycle. Maturity mismatch, long dreams funded by short paper, goes from clever to lethal the moment the window shuts. Factories still had machines. Farms still had land. Trains still had steel wheels and tracks. Money, however, is not an object. It is an agreement, a ritual of trust that turns objects into commerce. In 1873, the ritual was suspended. Merchants refused to extend trade credit because the best customer was the cash customer. Banks refused to discount bills because cash might be needed to meet withdrawals. Railroads delayed payments to suppliers, who delayed wages, who shortened consumption, which darkened revenue projections, which forced new write-downs, which prompted more refusals. The freeze fed itself. The aftermath made patience feel like a superstition. The phrase many would use, long depression, captured the mood if not every statistic. Prices fell for years. Output in some sectors rose while nominal revenues sagged, a paradox only to those who confuse money with wealth. Deflation plays cruel arithmetic. A farmer who grows more wheat might earn fewer dollars and yet owe the same number of dollars on last season's loan. A factory that learns to produce more with less labor might face a price decline that outpaces its efficiency gains. Those with liquid cash saw bargains and bought. Those with debt saw judgment days arrive at the regular rhythm of coupon dates. Politics found a voice equal to the pain. The story that galvanized the countryside of America was simple. Demonetization of silver had strangled prices and enriched bondholders. Whether complete or not, the narrative matched the lived experience of anyone paying fixed debts with shrinking cash flows. Free silver rallies, greenback agitation, and a broader rural revolt against the urban credit system erupted. Bankers answered that stability and credibility were the prerequisites of prosperity. And if discipline pinched now, it was preserved later. The debate turned money into ethics. Who deserved relief and who deserved rigor? Monetary regimes are never just arithmetic. They are moral stories imposed on the ledger. None of this was confined by borders. By the 1870s, finance was already international. European investors bought American railway bonds by the box. American brochures promised tenfold growth in the population of towns that barely had streets. The moment Vienna trembled, funds intended for Montana, Minnesota, and the Dakotas lingered in Hamburg and Paris, or fled to gold coins stacked in vaults. Telegraphy increased the speed of rumor without increasing the speed of verification. Information outran audits. In such conditions, the rational move was the first move. Exit beat patience. In Central Europe, universal banks both funded and owned industrial capacity, so a balance sheet problem in the bank transmitted immediately to the factory floor. The world had converged on tighter standards just as it converged on integrated markets. Convergence brings efficiency and shared vulnerability. Eventually, the river thawed, as rivers do, with cracking, unpredictability, and danger near the edges. Banks rebuilt capital through caution. Governments nudged policy at the margins, sometimes restoring limited coinage, sometimes loosening regulations on note issuance, sometimes merely encouraging the confidence no law can manufacture. Investors with cash returned one bargain at a time. Lines consolidated, weak roads merged into stronger networks. Efficiency rose, not because visionaries designed it, but because necessity imposed it. The world did not abandon grand projects. It relearned that the funding of grand projects required sturdier scaffolding than the public AS mood and a banker S reputation. Strip the episode to its gears, and the mechanism is plain. The first gear is refinancing dependence. Enterprises built on continuous access to new capital cannot accept a pause without swallowing insolvency. The second gear is collateral correlation. When everyone holds the same popular assets, a problem in one issuer becomes a markdown in all issuers, forcing sales that push prices down further. The third is monetary constraint, not only in coin but in expectation. A public shift toward a harder standard can chill credit long before statutes fully bite. The fourth is information speed outrunning verification. Technology that moves messages faster than facts rewards fear over patience. Put those gears together and the system locks. Not forever, but long enough to convert exuberance into austerity and plans into auctions. Echoes are easy to hear in any century. Project finance funded by short liabilities had many later avatars: canals and cotton mills, utility booms, telegraph lines, fiber optics, real estate developers stacking short-term paper against long-term buildings. Standards kept changing, but the feeling of scarcity and transition did not. Reputation underwrote markets then as now. When a marquee intermediary stumbled, a choir lost its pitch. None of these patterns require a puppet master. They require human habits, extrapolating good times, mistaking liquidity for safety, mistaking a crowd's embrace for due diligence. Survival in a freeze is not mystical. Cash flow that arrives without a capital raise outlives hype. Diversity of collateral protects when fashions turn, because if everyone wants to sell what you own, the market you need will not exist. Funding duration that matches the life of the asset is not conservative. It is freedom from the calendar's tyranny. Standards matter. Maps of the monetary battlefield determine which regiments are encircled when retreat is ordered. It is a hard truth that in 1873, the winners looked boring. Operators who cut costs and still ran trains on time, treasurers who sighed at low yields and slept without fear, investors who spent spring being mocked for caution and winter being thanked by their heirs. Beneath the yields and the yield curves, the story is human. Immigrants followed rails west because rails promised towns, schools, and trade. Craftsmen took wages that included promises as well as coins. Farmers shipped harvests at prices set half a world away by men who never saw a wheat field. Clerks and tellers stood at counters and watched their neighbors turn into frightened depositors. A panic is an audit of connections. Who owes whom? Who trusts whom? Who must pay when a promise becomes a performance? Political anger in the decade that followed was not mere sentiment. It was the ledger speaking through crowds. Yet even in the ice, there was a cold arithmetic of opportunity. Freezes redistribute ownership. Assets that cannot be financed at boom prices change hands at frostbitten ones. Consolidations that looked unimaginable in 1872 looked inevitable in 1875. The map of American railways shifted, not because central planners designed a perfect network, but because liquid buyers assembled one by necessity. Patience, so easy to caricature during euphoria, acquired a new nickname: buying power. There is a final lesson that resists comfort. The Panic of 1873 did not arrive because the rails vanished, the factories broke, or gold fled the earth. It arrived because confidence was the bridge between long projects and short promises, and that bridge was narrowed by policy, overloaded by speculation, and shaken by a silence that began in Vienna and echoed everywhere. Money, in the end, is trust measured through time. Standards define how that trust is stored. Markets define how it is traded. Institutions define who gets to certify it. When policy tightens, when markets grow skittish, when institutions go from selling optimism to counting losses, the trust that felt like bedrock feels like ice. So when a boom explains that the old rules no longer apply, remember a handful of stubborn truths written into 1873. Liquidity is borrowed. It can be recalled on a Tuesday afternoon. Reputation is collateral only until it is tested, and then it is a line outside a locked door. Monetary design is not scenery. It is the stage on which the drama either ends with bows or ends with fire. Grand ventures can transform nations, but if their funding depends on tomorrow's kindness, those nations will learn how cold a balance sheet can be when kindness takes a holiday. There is always a season when optimism is disciplined by arithmetic. There is always a day when rollovers do not roll, when collateral that looks universal looks uniform and uniformity is a problem. The winter of credit passes, as all winters pass, but it leaves shapes in the landscape that last for generations. Consolidated industries, cautious treasurers, political movements born in frustration and matured in rhetoric. Arguments about silver and gold that sound like arguments about fairness, because that is what they are. A memory that whispers into future booms, not loudly enough to prevent them, but loudly enough to inform anyone willing to listen. The track still shines under the sun. The steel still sings when a locomotive crosses a bridge. The lesson is the same in every age. The rails may carry everything else, but trust carries the rails. When trust narrows to a bridge too slim for the traffic of a civilization, the busiest system in the world can feel as still as a frozen river.